Me? Great. Hi everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Maria O'Lone and I am the Head of Planning and Environment at Tunes. That's what I do to earn my crust. And I've been asked to give you a presentation on change of use opportunities and basically give you a bit of an update. I'm going to caveat that, as all lawyers do, with this is a presentation that the RICS are asking lots of lawyers to deliver all across the country. As you may know, our legislation is very different to England and Wales, so you might have seen a few bullet points that were presented. They're not necessarily applicable, but we'll talk about that in the course of the presentation. So you might ask, well, what are you going to talk about? So what is a change of use? You might say that's a pretty obvious question. Hopefully you'll find out it's not necessarily as obvious as it might appear. When do you need planning permission for a change of use? I'll talk you through some of the permitted development rights, and I'll give you some practical examples and some practical outworkings of that. And then I'll finish up by giving you a very quick run through and highlight some recent consultations and developments that might pave the way for some future reform in the area. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. If anybody has any questions, stick your hand up, shout out, do it by way of interpretive dance, ask me a question. I'm more than happy to deal with it. As long as it's not on sport, I'm not going to be able to help you with sport. So I'll give you a bit of an overview. As most of you know, Planning Act 2011 is now our primary legislation for Northern Ireland, and it makes provision for lots of planning functions. In the main, they'll be exercised by the council. The department also has some powers in terms of calling in applications and strategic applications. I've given you a list in the PowerPoint of the main subordinate legislation as well. That, to be fair, is more for your reference. If you are suffering from insomnia, feel free. You'll get those on statutelaw.gov.uk. There's also a helpful, handy summary for non-lawyers, albeit it is probably also sleep-inducing, which is the Development Management Practice Note. That's very much aimed at planners in local councils, but it's a pretty good feel for how they should be interpreting the legislation. But it's quite high level, but it gives you a good overview. So we'd recommend, if you're stuck, have a look at those. Failing that, drop me an email or give me a call and I'll point you in the right direction. So the first thing that you need to know about whether something is a change of use is, well, what's development? And effectively you can split it into two. There's operational development, and there's 4 different kinds: building, engineering, mining, or other operations. Or, and this is the one that we're going to be dealing with today, the making of any material change in the use of any buildings or other land. And the key word there is material. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about what that might mean. There is a distinction between operations and use. And again, it's just useful to know that because sometimes people get a little bit confused. Operations are something that results in a physical change or alteration to the land, and it has some degree of permanence. So my rule of thumb is, do you need a builder to do it? Then that's probably an operation. And if it's not, then it could be a change of use. So change of use effectively is kind of fairly obvious, I suppose. The activities that you do in or alongside or on the land, but they don't actually interfere with the physical characteristics of the land. So that's kind of the distinction. But as I say, if you want a rule of thumb is, do you need a builder? No, then it's probably a change of use. So uses that don't involve development, well, there are some exceptions that the legislation sets out. And effectively, some of them are, if it's within the curtilage of a dwelling house and it's incidental to the enjoyment of the dwelling house. So that would be things like, somebody has a hobby of fixing cars, but they only really fix their own car, a classic car or something like that. That's fine. If he's fixing a dozen cars belonging to other people, that's not incidental. So that kind of gives you an idea. Again, it would be something for the purposes of agriculture or forestry, and if it was use of a building for those purposes, so using a shed to keep cattle in, that's fine. And then I suppose the last one then there is in the case of buildings or other land which is used for a purpose of any class specified in an order made by the department for the purposes of that section, effectively using it. In English, that means if it's the same use class, that's fine. So if your permitted use is a retail use and your the first use is to sell clothes and the second use is to sell hats, that's fine. There's no issue there, and you don't need a separate planning permission. And then we have the General Permitted Development Order, and really what this does is it grants planning permission for certain classes of development that are set out in the schedule without you having to fill out a form and pay a fee. So it's effectively, it grants planning permission, you don't need to do anything further, and if you fit within one of those categories, that's absolutely fine, you don't need to do anything further. And again, just to flag up, the council can effectively make regulations to remove permitted development rights, and the permitted development rights generally don't apply to listed buildings, and in certain cases in some conservation areas as well. So there are some exceptions to the GDPO in itself. So Schedule 1, Part 4 sets out 6 classes of permitted material changes of use, and if you have a look at that section, it allows changes between certain use classes, and they're quite specific on what you're allowed to do, and there's some specific limits on those, but it's what I call a ratchet, so you can go forward, but you can't go back. So it's just to be aware of that. It is regarded as development, but you don't need to obtain planning permission if you meet those criteria. And I mentioned this at the start, just beware of the good news story. Sometimes if you're reading some of your professional press articles and things like that, you'll see references to all these new permitted development rights. Most of them don't apply here. Do apply in England and Wales. And just to give you an example, there's much wider rights in England and Wales for the conversion of agricultural buildings, including residential, retail and some industrial uses. There's also requirements to take into account existing noise sources when permitting conversion, say, offices to a residential use, which is permitted in certain circumstances in England and Wales. Again, they don't apply here, but you will be reading about them and think, oh, that sounds great. It doesn't. But it may be that our legislation starts to fall into line. The one exception to that is I would be very surprised if we ever had the permitted development right to convert agricultural buildings into residential. Just the nature of, our agrarian economy, etc. I think they'd be keen to keep control on that. So I'd mentioned earlier that the key aspect is material change of use. And planning permission is required if it is a material change of use in the buildings or on land. Very unhelpfully, the 2011 Act doesn't make any definition of what is material. Now, it does specify 2 specific examples of what is a material change of use. The deposit of waste on land is one, and the subdivision of a dwelling house. So if you want to subdivide a big house into a couple of apartments, that very much does require planning permission. The deposit of waste on land, for any of you that would deal a lot with farmers and so on, that's one you need to be very alive to for a whole host of reasons. I'm wearing my environmental lawyer hat now, that it is permissible for farmers to deposit, for example, topsoil on their land. They can get a waste management licence exemption. It's very important that they do that. But they need to have planning permission first, and that's sometimes where they fall down. They think, oh, this is exempt from the waste legislation. They don't realise they have to apply for an exemption, and then they're told you need to apply for an exemption, and then they're told, but you need planning permission to apply for the exemption. So that's just something to file back in your mind, and if you have anybody that raises that as a query, that hopefully you'll remember that. because I have to say a large part of my practice, I would say, is from people who've been caught out with that and are facing prosecution in the courts, and it does carry a prison term. So, as I say, useful point to remember. So what's the relevant case law on this? And lawyers love this, sorry. It's all a question of fact and degree, which means, if it quacks like a duck and moves like a duck, probably is a duck. And East Barnet is one of the key cases, as is Bendel's Motors. And Lord Parker effectively said it's a question of fact and degree in every case, and really, they have to say that the planning authority couldn't reasonably have reached that conclusion. So to give you some practical examples, to be or not to B and D, there's a lot of, movement and push in Belfast, but also in other cities across the UK for Airbnb service departments, and service departments is particularly a big growth area in Belfast. If you speak to anybody in the tourism trade, they'll tell you there is a shortage of hotel accommodation, and that's something that is plugging the gap. We're obviously putting a bid in for the Rugby World Cup, and if we get that, there'll obviously be an increased demand for tourist accommodation. So this is kind of very live, if you like, at the moment. And the Moore case looked at an 8-bedroom house, previously occupied by a family, and then it was, didn't do any physical alterations to the house, but they started renting it out to quite large groups, kind of up to about 18 people, for short periods of time for holiday lettings. And it was found that that was a material change of use by a planning inspector. Went to the courts, and the court said, well, it's a matter of fact and degree, and they looked at really the particular circumstances of the use. Now, in that case, and I suppose the distinguishing feature was the people using it weren't family groups. So it wasn't like, mum, dad, and 8 children were going on holiday and using this house. It was for like yoga retreats, fitness kind of retreats, and that sort of things. So it was very often strangers who were using the home, and that was something that the courts thought, well, that's actually that's extreme, and that's really quite different to a residential dwelling in terms of the nature of the use, etc. And they said, no, that is a change that does require planning permission. That is a material change of use. And if you compare this to the Moore case, that was a very different approach of the courts in that case. And what they said was there was 10 self-contained 2-bed apartments, very similar in the sense of available to the public for short lets, kind of weekend breaks, a couple of days, but right the way through to longer term type lets for 3 and 4 months, for somebody who's moving house, or somebody who's getting divorced and that type of thing, that they were there for a longer period of time, albeit a sort of a shorter term let, or on a month by month basis. They were managed as one kind of unit or business, and there was a cleaning and a maid service, but they didn't provide meals as such, but they maybe provided a hamper with bread and milk and that type of thing. And they said, in this case, it didn't constitute a change of use. They said, well, even though they were managed as a whole, really when you looked at it in the round, the courts were satisfied in that case that it didn't require a change of use. But I think the key element there was probably the size of each individual unit, and it wasn't that suddenly they were going to generate so much more traffic in the way that a very large family home occupied by one family versus, four couples, if you like, with 4 cars and 4, So I think that was the key distinguishing feature. And I kind of mentioned local interpretation. And what I would say is the service department example. I know Belfast City Council, in response to complaints, to be frank, from residents in an apartment block where quite a number of the apartments were service apartments, wrote to the owners and said, well, you know, we think this is a sui generis use and that you require planning permission to use them and operate them as service departments. And I was involved in that, and we had a fairly lengthy conversation with them, and they ultimately accepted that it was a dwelling use, but it was quite a large block. There wasn't a huge number as a proportion. A lot of the apartments were actually sort of more long-term, you know, business people being posted for several months at a time, and that type. But there were a few that were being used for the hen and the stag weekends, and that type of use of what we would consider being a more, I suppose, noxious use and a more akin to a bed and breakfast type affair. And if you look across the water, particularly in London, but some other authorities as well, they have expressly excluded the right to operate these kind of short-term lets or Airbnb type of arrangements or the service departments, and they've said you need planning permission for these. And certainly a lot of the London boroughs have done that, and there's been quite a few investment companies who had invested in the service department sector really had sought to resist that, but you know that's been successful. So it's something that would be interesting to see. Belfast City Council would be the obvious target. Maybe Derry City Council might also adopt that approach. But it's an interesting thing, and I think it is something that we're going to see a lot more of. And I do wonder, will we see a tighter regulation of it and a restriction on those permitted development rights? And you know, you need only look at Belfast City Council's approach to student housing and purpose-built student housing, and how that has been dealt with. So I would say watch this space on that one. As I said, it's quite topical because it's seen as a good investment in many respects. I'll talk a little bit about agricultural permitted development rights. And you know how those might work, and give you some, again, practical examples. But I would say with the practical examples for the agricultural, it'll hopefully give you a flavour for some other types of, I suppose, approaches to permitted development rights in other sectors. So if you look at Part 7 of the General Permitted Development Order and Class A, it permits certain things, you know, works for the erection, extension or alteration of a building necessary for the purposes of agriculture within that particular unit. So in terms of being able to put up, you know, cow sheds and storage sheds and that type of thing, but there are limits on the sizes of those, and there is a consultation out to propose to increase, to allow an increase in those size limits. I would expect that will come through, because it reflects, I suppose, changes in farming practices, that farms are getting bigger and so on. It expressly excludes the conversion to a dwelling house, and that's in contrast to the situation in England and Wales, where there is provision to convert agricultural buildings to a dwelling house. I mentioned Part 5, Class B, because that's one that's quite useful for farmers, but also anybody who owns kind of waste ground, or, well, what we would call waste ground or other ground, to be able to turn a few pounds out of it. It allows a temporary use for not more than 28 days in a particular year, to use it for anything. So to give you an example, a farmer owns a field opposite me. I arrived home in the summer to see a big top being erected and the circus was there for a week, which is a bit annoying for me, but there we go. No need for planning permission for that. He was able to do that without any difficulty. But again, it's useful for landholders who, for example, if there's an event going on in the city centre, or you know, event going on somewhere, they could use it for a car park. And that's the common thing that you'll see. So if there's some kind of, you know, large event going on, or you know, a client has a derelict piece of land, they can turn a few pounds out of it for that. for 14 days per year you can hold a market or motor racing. They're seen as, obviously a bit more noisy and, well, certainly the motor racing, so that's why it's a lesser period. But say, those last two aren't just agricultural, that's any land that has no buildings on it. So as I say, if somebody has a bit of waste ground and infill site that they're waiting to develop, they can use it for 28 days. Whenever you're looking at kind of permitted development rights and ancillary uses for agriculture, you need to understand what the legal definition of agriculture is. And this is it. It's quite wide. I would argue it's a little bit wider again than that definition, and we'll talk about that. But you can see that it covers most things that you would expect, and maybe a few that you wouldn't, in terms of market gardens and nursery grounds and things like that, and so on. So if you keep that definition in your mind when you're looking at it, there's changes of use, and then there's ancillary use, and so it's important to understand what an ancillary use is. And I'd mentioned the example in a householder context of somebody who wants to fix a classic car, and that's fine. And farming is an interesting one. There's obviously a big push on farms to diversify and to try and earn some extra cash and milk the asset, pardon the pun. And small scale processing, such as kind of making cheese or butter or packaging and grading fruit and vegetables, might not require planning permission. The use of a single bedroom in the farmhouse as a bed and breakfast type accommodation is probably fine. Depending on the size of the house, you might get away with two, but one certainly you will. And again, small scale machinery repair. So if a farmer is using a shed to fix tractor tires and that type of thing, and other people are coming and bringing that type of thing to fix, again, that is probably regarded as an ancillary, but I'll talk you through some of the case law on that. So farm shops, I don't know about you, but when you're sort of driving around the countryside, you seem to see a lot more farm shops and kind of artisan butchers on farms and that type of thing. And it's a great way to diversify your business and earn a bit of extra cash if you're a farmer. But the important distinction about whether you require planning permission or not is, are you selling the produce that you yourself produce, or are you importing goods from elsewhere for sale? And what I would say to you is, if the vast majority of the stuff is coming from your own farm and you're selling a few jam jars from Mrs. Smith down the road or a few eggs from Mr. Jones down the road, it's probably okay. But any more than literally a few jam jars, you probably need planning permission. So it's really, the importance is the de minimis, and that's why I say it would literally have to be, a couple of dozen eggs from somebody down the road, but really not much more than that. And there was a couple of cases on that, and a material change of use occurred when the imported goods accounted for 10% of the sales. So it really is quite a small amount if you think about it. And that was regarded as a change of use, and that would require planning permission. And again, this is another case, the Allen case. Again, it's the same thing. I would flag up, in England, it's now a specific permitted development. Our legislation hasn't followed suit, and certainly at the moment I'm not aware of any proposals to change that. I think that's unfortunate. I think it would be quite a positive thing for, it's not that every farm is going to do it, it just wouldn't be suitable for every farm, but you can see for certain farmers that would be a very positive thing for them to be able to do. But and then we move on to processing, and processing is quite different to farm shop, and it's a grey area. And Salvatore Cumbo is an English case, and it looked at the definition of agriculture in the Town and Country Planning Act, and it's very similar to the definition that I gave you at the start. And it said, the court said, well, it's quite broad, but on the face of it, it doesn't include processing. And they said, in that case, planning permission would be required for the installation of a cheese making process, which would use most of the liquid production off the farm. I would caveat that case by saying I don't think that's a definitive authority, because really that case was concerned with the retention of a residential unit for an agricultural worker, and the issue about whether processing and cheese production, whether that required planning permission, was it was a very minor point of the case. So I would say kind of gives you some indication, but it's not the whole story. Millington was a more recent case and a more helpful case. And this was whether or not winemaking from grapes grown on the farm was in fact an agricultural use. And you might say, Maria, that's terribly interesting, I like to buy some wine, but what's that got to do with Northern Ireland? We're not exactly known for our wine production. No, we're not. But if anybody from Armagh? No, nobody from Armagh. Obviously, a lot of the cider apples come from Armagh, and there's a huge trend for your artisan beer, artisan cider, etc. And again, it's one of those things I can see. It's not going to be wine, but possibly cider, possibly gin, possibly some other things. So what did the court say about that? Well, Secretary of State said, look, when these grapes are produced or crushed, effectively there's a new product created, and that couldn't be described as effectively a use for the purpose of agriculture. And the court said, that's terribly interesting, Secretary of State, but we disagree with you. And they said, we're going to look at this. And they said, well, wine, etc., on a small scale, that's absolutely fine. And if somebody who grows grapes or apples, that's a perfectly reasonable use. That's everything. But the interesting thing about that case was they looked at what the European definition of agriculture was. So they said, yeah, we've seen what the Town and Country Planning Act says. Very interesting. The European definition specifically includes winemaking. Now, if that had been a case involving cider, I don't know how it would have turned, but the key issue there was the scale of the development. It was relatively small scale, but it was still a pretty big operation. In fairness, it wasn't de minimis by any stretch of the imagination. It's quite a large facility. And they said, but the courts actually helpfully set out a test and said, is it reasonably necessary to make the product marketable or disposable to profit? Or whether it has come to the stage where the operations cannot reasonably be said to be consequential on the agricultural operations of producing the crop. And really what that means is they think, well, would anybody buy those grapes, in this case, in their sort of natural format? Probably not. I mean, I don't know a huge amount about wine production, but I don't think wine grapes are eating grapes. And there's issues about transport and them spoiling and so on and so forth. So you can see, certainly in winemaking, that's an issue. To give my sort of Armagh example of cider production, it's an interesting one that without cider production, a lot of the apples in Armagh would go to waste. Most of them go for producing apple juice or cider. So it's an interesting one. As I say, it's an interesting case in the sense of the context of kind of the trend for artisan beer and so on. I think we will see a few cases that will come up in respect of sort of small craft breweries in bars. Certainly, again, there's been a trend in the US and a trend here and in England for bars to sort of sell themselves as kind of hipster, we produce our own beer type thing. And they're producing beer, gin, all sorts of things. And I think we may see a few cases where that becomes a planning issue. And at what point is that ancillary, and what point is that? And there is some licensing issues, I should say, around brewing and distilling of alcohol as well. So, to kind of giving you a very, very quick whistle-stop tour of, when do you need planning permission, when do you need to seek to rely on your permitted development rights. But what do you do if you're not sure? And I would say apply for a certificate of lawful development. I very often am asked to advise banks on the financing of projects, and very often it is quite hard to ascertain as a lawyer and to advise and to say, yes, this is absolutely ancillary, there's no difficulty. And I always have to sort of say, well, if it's too much, and it is a question of fact and degree, and a certificate of lawful development effectively is your get out of jail free card. You can show that to any bank and say, council says it's fine, there's no issue here. There is a cost involved with that, and unfortunately the cost is pretty comparable to applying for planning permission. It's certainly, I think it's about 50%, but I need to double check that for you. So it's substantial. It's not an insubstantial fee, but it depends on what you're applying for. Sometimes it'll be quite a small amount, in terms of you not enlarging the site or so on. So just check what the fee is. But it is certainly very useful to have that certificate of lawful development. You can also apply in advance, before you do it, certificate of lawfulness of a proposed development. And again, that is helpful because it gives you some certainty before you invest a lot of money in a new production process or a change of use or a fit out or something of that nature. It gives you a little bit of certainty before you do that. The advantage with a certificate of lawfulness as well is they aren't advertised. And you might say, well, why is that relevant? Well, if it's something that you think a neighbour's not going to be overly happy about or might create some waves or create some difficulty, it's not advertised, and it's generally a paper exercise effectively, and it's worth looking at, if not for nothing else for those reasons, and it's worth doing. I should also say once if you've carried out if you've had some development works, as in you've put a building up or something like that, obviously there's immunity from enforcement in any event after a number of years, after 5 years. So again, it's something to bear in mind. And then in terms of all of, I suppose, the overall, there is a lot of opportunity there to use permitted development rights, to use changes within a particular use class, to use ancillary rights as well, without the need for planning permission. And I suppose the examples I've given you are kind of the, I suppose, in the hospitality sector and in the agricultural sector, but that's also true in terms of some of the retail and other commercial sectors. And it'll be interesting to see, certainly my experience to date, it's still fairly fresh. My experience is most local councils are being slow enough to take enforcement action, and they're being quite cautious in how they interpret what's ancillary, what's permitted, what's not permitted. That might change, of course, but I certainly would say I've seen a falling off of enforcement action by comparison to what it was when it was with planning service, but that's maybe also partly a resource issue as well in terms of, I know planning service did pump a lot of money effectively, or people, into their enforcement section for a period of time. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. Now, I'd mentioned I would talk to you about some consultations as well. Always think consultations are interesting in the sense of it shows you what way the thought processes are going and the way things might develop. We've had a consultation that closed in June 2016, and it really talked about a couple of different potential changes, and it was developments by electronic communication code operators. That's people like, you know, your mobile phone operators and that type of thing. And that was really talking about, they have existing permitted development rights, allowing them to replace existing masts and antenna and so on. And that allows them to increase the height slightly. These proposals are really to extend those powers to increase the height slightly further again. So that's kind of an interesting one. The proposals around non-domestic solar photovoltaic panels is really kind of to bring things into line with the way it is for domestic properties, to really remove the requirements for planning permission, provided, you know, they don't cover more than a certain proportion of the roof and so on, and don't sit higher than a certain amount from the roof, etc. Again, the extent to which that will be made use of, as and when it comes in, will very much depend on what's happening with ROCs and renewable incentives and so on, which, as we know, have been slashed. I would say it's a little bit, unfortunately, a wee bit too late for that particular permitted development right, in my opinion, but useful nevertheless to see it. In terms of electric vehicle charging points, again, it's to try and encourage the use of electric cars and electric vehicles, and really to remove the restrictions on obtaining consent for those charging points, and to make that much easier and much quicker, because people aren't going to take it up if they can't find a charging point. In relation to the shops and financial and professional services establishments, it's really to allow them to extend, which will allow extensions to 50% of the original floor space or 100 square metres, whichever is the lesser. Again, it's just to introduce some other permitted development rights in respect of loading bays. So it's really just to help small extensions effectively in the retail and professional services sector, to kind of smaller type units. The other one that I mention is the consultation in respect of permitted development rights for mineral exploration, and quite a lot of permitted development rights around that. They allow temporary explorations for without the need to apply for planning permission. Simply have to notify the department of an intention to do it, and the department then has a very short window of opportunity to say, no, actually you do need planning permission. Really, this is a response to Woodburn Forest and the oil exploration that took place up there. There was quite a lot of press coverage about it, and quite a lot of social media coverage regarding that development, and as to why it didn't require planning permission. And as I say, that was quite controversial, and I think the consultation is really designed to plug that gap and to address it. And in truth, it's something that will cover a range of activities, not just oil and gas exploration, but it's also exploration for things like gold and so on, which we're seeing out kind of OMA direction. There's quite a few different issues with that going on. So there's a few consultations kicking around that might affect permitted development rights. As yet we haven't seen any legislation coming out of them, but I imagine we will very shortly. So that's it. I suppose just in conclusion, a change of use, you don't always need planning permission. As we've seen, it's very much a question of fact and degree. You can rely on permitted development rights, and there will be sort of further changes. So that's all I have to say, but I imagine some of you might have some questions or some things that you would like to ask me, so feel free. Or does everybody want to beat traffic?
I'll start you off
permission. It depends on how much floor space is occupied by the office use and the extent to which is the more dominant use. If it is truly related to the warehouse business, and the example I would usually give is not necessarily office use, but like a trade counter is the one that people kind of think of. So you've got a warehouse with baths for, and they have a trade counter, so if you're a plumber you can rock up and say, you've got taps in your catalogue and the bath, I'll have that, that's fine. And the floor space to the counter is actually probably quite small, and the major part of the business is mail order or whatever, and they leave the warehouse. That's fine, but if it suddenly becomes and showroom use might be fine in that case, where somebody can walk around and go, yeah, I'll have that one. But once it creeps into that's the predominant use of it, then you will need planning permission. Now, in your example of the office use, if it's a warehouse or something, yeah. So if it was say a warehouse is yeah. Yeah, so it would depend on not only the floor space isn't definitive on the point, but like the number of visitors to the site and whether that was predominantly different. So the trade counter is a good example of if there's hundreds upon hundreds of cars every day coming to this trade counter, it's really a retail use with the storage being ancillary, as opposed to yeah, you can go and pick it up there if you want, if that's handy to you, but not a major point. So it would be not only floor space we would look at, but also kind of footfall and movements, and were all of the people engaged in servicing what went on in the rest of the warehouse, or are they engaged in other aspects of the business, if that makes sense.
I got planning permission to convert a stable in a hen house into residential. I've got planning permission for that. It's happening at the moment. I have to go home and get the hens put into it. Before a fox gets it.
Excellent. I thought that was going to be the basis of a very difficult question. I don't know. Yeah, yeah, whatever they need.
Is it likely that you would fall between two stools, or at the moment my understanding is that if you wait 2 years to build another 500 square metres, you can get around it?
Yeah, your understanding is right, and I would be saying, as and when new legislation comes out, you probably still have to wait 2 years for the first shed to build the bigger one. Now, whether you could extend the existing shed to comply with the new one, it would depend on the wording of the new legislation.
Good test for a permitted development request.
Yeah, it would. Lawfulness, yeah. It would depend on how it was phrased. I know some other legislation, like for household extensions when it came in, that the advice was yes, you could extend out, but it just depends whether the wording mirrors that or there's some exclusion to it. If it says, well, if you built anything in the last 2 years or whatever, but it is quite possible. But yeah. So sorry, that's not a very straight answer to your question, but because we don't have any legislation yet, it's hard to say. But I know from looking at the resi development, certainly at the time when they increased some of those, the advice was, well, actually, yes, you could extend it out to that kind of cubic metre.
Like that 500 square metres was a reduction where it was historically.
That's right. Yeah. So I think certainly the proposals that are being worked up are suggesting to increase it back to what it used to be. So positive. Any more? In that case, I will release you, but I'll stay around for a couple of minutes if any of you want to ask me any questions that aren't recorded. I'm more than happy to do that. But thank you all for your time, and I'll see you all again. Thank you.